Welcome. The modern English word godly abbreviates the Middle English word godlike, and one key Christian value is that of becoming godlike, that is, having the character of God, who, in Christian belief, is revealed in Jesus of Nazareth. As centuries passed, Christians within and beyond the Roman world developed a range of practices and institutions for developing godlike, that is, Christ-like, character. Today, we'll take a look at these and follow their development into the Latin-speaking West in later centuries. Christian ideas about morality are rooted in an array of sources. Some are Jewish, such as the Hebrew Scriptures, known in Christianity as the Old Testament. There is plenty of moral guidance in the Old Testament, such as the Ten Commandments. Another source of Christian morals came from the wider Roman world. Here we need to do a bit of myth busting. Pre-Christian pagans are often stereotyped as hedonistic, but in truth, no culture has ever operated this way. If you sit down and read ancient Greek and Roman authors, you'll find that they had rich traditions of moral and ethical reflection. As with so much else, Jewish and Roman elements intermingled in Christianity. Morality always involves self-discipline, or to use the Greek word askesis. Askesis gives us the word asceticism. It literally means self-discipline, especially that of athletes. Throughout the Christian scriptures, the Christian life is described as being like an athletic contest, specifically a race. The reason is simple. Whether in faith or in competition, what you start, you finish, and you run to win. Christianity requires self-discipline. That is, Christianity requires askesis. Every form of athletic training, like every form of self-discipline, shows the glories, the limits, and the failures of embodied existence. Ideally, the Christian was a kind of martyr to their own distorted desires. To use the language of the New Testament, the Christian was a martyr to their flesh. By the 4th century, some Christians described askesis as a kind of internalized martyrdom, and this became normative in later Christian centuries. Askesis found institutional expression through what is called monasticism. In the late 3rd century, small numbers of men and women began living lives of prayer, work, and service in the Egyptian desert. They often lived alone in isolation. Hence the word monasticism, which comes from the Greek word monachos, which means solitary. But solitary life did not remain the norm. Communal monasticism became dominant. But both forms of monasticism involved foregoing various pleasures in this life, such as a rich diet, sex, and marriage. Diet and dress were kept simple. Activities such as prayer and service, and especially the giving of charity to those in need, were made central. Men who practiced monasticism came to be known as monks. Women came to be known as nuns. They were sought out for their spiritual advice and were often believed to be filled with the Holy Spirit and capable of working miracles. But monks, and to a lesser extent nuns, also played another role in Christian history. They were the main missionaries for more than 1,000 years. Some of this points back to the Apostle Paul and his views on celibacy. In his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul wrote that those who forego marriage are single-minded for God. But monasticism also shared points of connection with Roman society, too. Like the philosophical schools of ancient Rome, Christian monasticism made vegetarianism the dietary norm. Its basic form of clothing, known as the monastic habit, was a simple and plain robe. This paralleled the simple clothing worn by ancient philosophers, often known as the philosopher's garb. As in morals, So too in monasticism, Christianity pulled from other ancient precedents. For many people, including many Christians today, the Apostle Paul's views on celibacy cut against other core elements of being human. But Jesus himself was no romantic. 3 of the New Testament Gospels, those of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all relate the same story about marriage in the afterlife. And it goes like this. Some Sadducees asked Jesus about a woman who outlived her first husband and remarried. She outlived her next husband and remarried again, and in the end, she married a total of 7 times, each time outliving her husband. The Sadducees asked Jesus, in the afterlife, who will be her husband? And Jesus responds, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die any more, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. So much for romantic love being eternal. But 2 things are worth noting here. First, according to Josephus, Sadducees didn't even believe in an afterlife. So this whole exchange not only points to the afterlife, but to fundamental differences within 1st century Judaism. Here, as elsewhere, Jesus is much closer to the Essenes and Pharisees. Second, and this is the more important point, Jesus' response had a profound influence upon later Christian tradition. Monastic groups, male and female, saw in his words a promise that the celibate life could be a kind of angelic existence here on earth. And this further buttressed, from the time of early Christianity, a privileging of celibacy over marriage. As monasticism grew, it was institutionalized in further ways. Men had their own places to live, called monasteries. Women lived in convents. Sometimes men and women lived in a shared space, but this did not work out. Celibacy is a difficult thing, and sexual desire proved inescapable in shared living arrangements. Monasticism proved influential in still other ways. The Romans expected all men and women to marry and have children, but from the beginning, Christians denied that this was necessary. This too followed the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he encouraged celibacy as single-minded devotion to God. By privileging celibacy, monasticism helped redefine the centrality of the family in Roman culture. This, in turn, had a significant effect upon women in Roman society. Convents became the first institutional framework in the ancient world where women could receive education. Convents and monasteries both prized literacy, but convents created an opportunity for women where none had previously existed. Ancient Christianity is thus notable for the rapid growth of women's religious writing from the 5th century onward. In Christian thought, humans are created in the image and likeness of God, but due to temptation and sin, we have fallen away from our initial state. Monastic literature developed this basic conviction into a kind of psychological literature aimed at developing Christian self-knowledge. According to monastic authors, because human beings are fallen, we are open to a range of external influences. Sometimes these are due to our desires, but, this same literature continues, external influences were sometimes spiritual, that is the product of evil spirits. From the monastic perspective, Christian self-knowledge entailed knowing how to distinguish these from one another. Monastic literature abounds with stories of angels and demons and other supernatural events, such as prophecies, visions, and healings. All forms of moral reflection, like all bodies of law, recognize that some acts are worse than others, and the same basic view developed within Christianity. Some sins, such as murder, are worse than others, such as cursing. In later medieval history, especially in the Latin-speaking West, some sins came to be known as deadly or mortal sins. For the sake of ease, a list was eventually developed known as the 7 deadly sins. They were lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. Note that these deadly sins are not just acts, they are often attitudes as well. Deadly sins were understood as those that removed Christians from a state of grace, that is, a state of right relationship with God. The mortal sins were distinguished from what were called venial sins, that is, sins you shouldn't do, but which don't imperil the soul. From this perspective, if you stub your toe and curse, you have committed a venial sin. You shouldn't do it, but your soul isn't imperiled by it. And just as there were 7 deadly sins, there were also 7 heavenly virtues: prudence, temperance, justice, courage, faith, hope, and charity, that is, love of one's neighbor. Here too, Christian thought depended upon both the Christian scriptures and pre-Christian precedent. And we can see that in this picture. Here the 7 virtues are ordered spatially. At the far left are prudence and justice. At the far right are courage and temperance. But in the center are 3 virtues, known in Christianity as the theological virtues. This comes from the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, in which he says that all spiritual things will pass away, but these 3 remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. And so, to the left is faith, to the right is hope, and at the center, love. A checklist of deadly sins and a checklist of heavenly virtues enabled the devout Christian to engage in self-reflection and therefore develop better self-knowledge. So what? Early Christian ideas about askesis, like later Christian ideas about deadly sins, have a very long afterlife. Here we see Saint Antony, perhaps the most famous of early Christian monks. As a young man, he heard the story of the rich young man read aloud in church. In this gospel passage, Jesus tells the rich inquirer to sell all that he has, give it to the poor, and then come and follow Jesus. But the rich young man cannot do so. He is literally enslaved to his possessions. Antony, however, took this passage quite seriously, and he took it literally. He sold everything and went away into the desert to spend a lifetime in prayer. While there, he became renowned for his spiritual wisdom, and he was visited, much to his annoyance, by a lot of people. Some sought advice, and others healing. Here we see one of the most famous portrayals of St. Antony. On the one hand, we see Antony besieged by demons. All represent various forms of temptation. However, if we look at Antony's face, we see that he is unperturbed. He looks serenely ahead. We find this too in monastic literature, the belief that prayer and other spiritual disciplines enable us to overcome temptation. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. Regardless of whether they were Christian, many people in the ancient world saw philosophy as a spiritual discipline. There was no finer introduction to this than Pierre Hadot's work, What is Ancient Philosophy? Don't let its very dry title put you off. It emphasizes philosophy as a way of life. And on a personal note, it's one of the best books that I've ever read. Next is Peter Brown's classic study, The Body and Society: Men, Women, and Sexual Renunciation in Early Christianity. Brown's work has had a decisive influence upon the modern study of Christian askesis. Finally is Patricia Ramp's fascinating volume, Women and the Religious Life in Pre-Modern Europe. Looking at both intellectual and social contexts, Ramp offers a helpful introduction to how Christianity redefined the roles of women. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.